in this third set of teachings in the Gospel of Matthew. Now let's recall for a moment where his story was set in his ministry. Up to this point, Jesus has been preaching about the new way. He's been teaching people about the new law and a simpler way to pray. He's been healing up a storm. He's kicked evil spirits out of good folks and into pigs who were so upset about the whole thing they ran right off a cliff. He called out his 12 farmers, as Eugene Peterson calls them in the message, and let them know what was to be expected of them. And he's been hanging around with all the wrong people. In short, he's been moving around the countryside doing all number of things that were disquieting to those of the empire. And some of it he even did on the Sabbath. So as our story begins, Jesus has been in the house having a talk with a small group of folks, including the farmers. More of a private chat. In fact, it's so private that even his mother and brothers can't get into the room. But after some time, Jesus walks out onto the beach. And in no time, a crowd has gathered. So Jesus steps into a boat and begins to preach. Episcopal priest and writer Barbara Brown Taylor is poetic in her description of Jesus in the water. His figure was swaying a little with each lift of the wave, his words full of life and as hard to hold as a handful of lake. Kate Huey on our national staff asked the question, what makes those full of life words so hard to hold? She notes, inside the house, Jesus could talk to his disciples candidly and directly. And we remember when he was direct with crowds in his earlier teaching, like on the Sermon on the Mount. But perhaps things have changed. It's time to switch to a new way of teaching. Out on the water in front of a crowd that could include spies from the empire and concerned religious authorities as well as pickpockets and thieves. Jesus turns to the common practice of the time, speaking in parables. And parables and their meanings are definitely hard to hold. So Jesus tells the gathered the story of the harvest, or the parable of the sower and the seeds, as is known in more traditional translations of the gospel. You heard the story, but let me share it with you in the New Revised Standard Version. And so he told them many things in parables, saying, listen, a sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seeds fell on the path, and birds came and ate them up. Other seeds fell on rocky ground, where they did not have much soil, and they sprang up quickly, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no roots, they withered away. Other seeds fell among the thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil and brought forth grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. Let anyone with ears listen. There you have it, a simple story. But what does it mean? It can be hard to hold on to. You may have noticed in this morning's reading that there was a hole in it. We skipped over verses 10 through 17. That's where the farmers, or disciples as we mostly know them, get into the story. They wanted to know why Jesus was telling stories. Recently, I participated in a Stanford University webinar on social media. I had the opportunity to listen to marketing professor Jennifer Aker talk about the powerful role social media can play in our lives. She's the author of a great book, The Dragonfly Effect, which is a guide for how social media can be used to propel social change. The biggest takeaway I got from her presentation was when she said that the most important role of a CEO of an organization is the collection and strategic sharing of stories. Who knew? Jesus could have taught at Stanford University and in the Graduate School of Business Skills. Well, Jesus certainly knew the power of stories because they provide the hearer with the opportunity to think more about the story. Jesus knew, as he explains to the farmers, that in order for people message different than they were expecting, they have to be ready to hear it. In fact, Jesus tells everyone to listen up, as Steve shared, at the beginning of the story, and then ask them at the end if they were really listening. Sometimes you have to change it up for folks in order to make a real difference. Right out of college, I came back to Phoenix and worked for Teros, which in those days was a drug abuse crisis agency. You may know it now, today, as a large behavioral health agency. And in fact, some of their vans are right across the street. But when they got started in the late 60s, they got started just a block over and down a little bit in an old house. It had grown more sophisticated by the time I got there in 1976 and had opened a counseling department. I had a friend who was a counselor in training at the time. He had come from the Lower East Side of Manhattan, where he had worked with heroin addicts. Willard was a really tough-minded guy. But Willard had been assigned to sit in with the director of the counseling program, a wizard of a social worker, if ever there was one, named Herb Margolis. In those days, a new approach to therapy was all the rage. It was called NLP, or Neuro-Linguistic Programming. Some of you may know. Willard came to me one day a little upset that he had to spend time with Herb. He told me that he had just been in a session observing Herb work with a guy who had a serious addiction problem. He said that Herb asked the client to relax and sit back and just listen to a story. As Willard recounted, Herb then proceeded to tell the guy a changed-up version of the story of the gift of the Magi. Now, like the disciples, and undoubtedly some of those who heard Jesus' story from the boat that day, Willard was upset. He may have wanted Herb to provide the client with some hard words about the consequences of his behavior and about his need to change. Or maybe some concrete examples or strategies for changing behaviors so he could lead a life of sobriety. Or maybe a clear description of the impact of his behavior on the lives of others. But what Willard really didn't think was appropriate was telling clients Christmas stories. But what Herb knew, and what Professor Aker knows, and what Jesus knew, is that sometimes you have to come at people from a different angle if you really want to have an impact. So let's get back to Synod. After my speech, it was time to wait for the voting. In order to be called by election, I needed to receive a vote of 60% of the delegates. The election was scheduled for Monday night, as Steve said. But the business of that day ran long, and after dinner, Ben and Jim and I were informed that the election was going to be delayed until Tuesday morning. While by that time I wasn't as worried as I had been about the outcome of the election, but still, it was tough. Well, I obviously got enough votes to be elected, for which I am so grateful. And Tuesday evening, I got to participate in the closing worship service. We 3 officers were blessed by wonderful women from Hawaii who placed these beautiful leis around our necks before we went on stage. Then the 5 of us officers were blessed by the youth of Synod, and we blessed them back. And then we all got to move out through the crowds assembled in a baptismal frenzy of flinging water of blessing on everyone. Some folks looked up with anticipation as I approached them. Others laughed. Some danced. But some put their heads down, trying to hide from the water. One guy even put up a little umbrella. Which brings us to the second part of today's reading. Let me remind you. Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the words of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what is sown in the heart. This is what was sown on the path. As for what was sown on the rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet such a person has no root, but endures only a while. And when trouble or persecution arises on account of the word, that person immediately falls away. And as for what was sown among the thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but cares for the world, and the lure of wealth chokes the word, and it yields nothing. But as for what was sown on good soil, this is the one who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and yields, in one case 100-fold, in another 60, and in another 30. The more traditional interpretation of this parable focuses on the readiness of the ground, or the hearers of the word. And in this retelling of the story, it's pretty clear. Jesus, after all, at this point, was talking not to the crowd, but to his insiders. In our hearing, we could easily focus on our own readiness, or that of others, to hear the word and be transformed. But it's a different focus which calls out to me today. Barbara Brown Taylor turns the story on its head, asking, what if it's not about us at all, but about the sower? What if it's not about our successes and failures and birds and rocks and thorns, but about the extravagance of a sower who flings